Let me try that again now that I'm unmuted. Welcome everybody to day 3 of the specific Aims Accelerator. So let's let everybody get settled in. We'll make sure that everything is working well behind the scenes. I am going to get ready to pull up my slides here, but just let me know in the chat if you can hear me okay. And we will get started. As always, please use the Q&A function if you have questions, and we'll get to those at the end of the lesson today. And use the chat just to let us know how things are going. And actually, let's do something a little different today that we haven't done in the previous 2 days. If you hear anything that really resonates with you, that you find really important, why don't you type it in the chat so that your neighbor, your colleague, can get the benefit as well in case they missed it. So if I can ask that of you today, I would really appreciate it. So yeah, just give me a thumbs up or let me know in the chat that you can hear me all right, and I will pull up my slides. You can hear. Great. Thanks, Kim. Good. Let me get these slides up and going. Good. All right. Next question. Can you see the slides? Great. Good. Okay, so I'm going to go full screen here and we will get started. Okay, so we are on day 3. And we are talking about section 2, which are goals and objectives. And I know that we've already had a few questions about the difference between goals and objectives and aims. And do not fear, do not fret. We will get to that today. All right, so today you will learn how to write your goals and objectives, which is section 2 of your Aims page. In my opinion, in my process, of course, right? There are different ways to write great Aims pages. This is the way that I recommend that you do it. It's been very successful for us as consultants and editors to present Aims pages in this way. And that's how I'm teaching you to do it. You'll also learn how to make sure that you're connecting the dots for your reviewers and not just trying to prove how smart you are. So I don't mean to offend anybody with that, but this is something that we do see a lot, especially among more junior investigators, early career folks. There's really this tendency to sort of prove that you've done the reading, right? Prove that you know what you're talking about, but that can actually end up undermining you. And we're going to talk about that and how to avoid that. Okay, so let us talk about the goals and objectives section. So the goal for this section is to situate your proposed project along a trajectory towards solving that big scientific problem that we talked about yesterday, and to describe the scientific premise of your research. All right, so we start out by describing your long-term goal. And the idea here is to give your reviewers a glimpse of the trajectory that you are on as a researcher. Your long-term goal should describe the program of research that you intend to pursue over several rounds of funding support as you chip away at this larger problem. So this long-term research goal should align with the problem that you described in the first section. In other words, your long-term research goal is to solve that big, juicy, scientific, clinical, or population level problem that you described in section 1, okay? Those two things, you want them to mirror each other. Next, we have the project objective. So next, you need to describe the overall objective of your proposed research project, the project that you're proposing in this grant, right? Big picture, your objective should be to fill the gap that you identified in that first section, right? So again, those two things need to mirror each other. It's smart here to frame the objective as something concrete, in other words, a deliverable, rather than something less tangible. So in other words, your objective should never be to study or to better understand. because there's no endpoint there, right? You can spend your entire life trying to understand something better. So when you're describing your objective, you want to describe it in terms of something concrete or sort of tangible, right? Something that you'll know what success looks like at the end of the project, okay? So this little schematic is intended to help you understand the connection between your goals and objectives and then the problem and the gap that we talked about yesterday, right? So your long-term goal goes beyond a single grant, a single project, and it requires multiple steps to achieve. Your long-term goal is to solve that problem, that big, interesting, juicy, scientific or clinical or population level problem that you described in the first section. Your overall objective is what you're trying to accomplish in this project that you are proposing, right? Your overall objective is to fill the gap in knowledge or the gap in thinking that's preventing the field from moving forward, preventing you from getting closer to solving this problem, right? So the overall objective contributes to your long-term goal, and filling that gap in knowledge contributes to ultimately solving that problem, okay? So that's how those pieces all connect. Now let's talk about the scientific premise and the general hypothesis, okay? So after you've declared your project objective, you need to explain the general or central hypothesis that motivates your project. It should be general enough to act as an umbrella for your specific aims, and it should be clear enough that it gives focus to your work. So you need to make sure that it's actually a hypothesis, right? Something that you can actually test. If your project is not hypothesis driven, you do not need to include a hypothesis because you don't have one, right? So you can include the research question that motivates the project instead of a general hypothesis, okay? So another piece to this, you want to make sure that when you write your hypothesis, that you're providing enough context for how you arrived there, right? How you arrived at your general hypothesis or at your research question. This is one of the trickiest parts of the Aims page because you don't want to get so mired in detail that you lose the story, but you do need to provide enough detail so that your general hypothesis or your research question is well-founded, right? We need to know how you got there. Like, why is this the question? Why is this the hypothesis? So this is typically where you would include a sentence or two about your preliminary data and or other supporting evidence. Okay, so that I know is a very short lesson. Again, we try to keep these as short and sweet as possible because I know that there's going to be a lot of questions. And we also want to make sure that you are taking action on these. So we're doing this day by day, chunk by chunk. Let me stop sharing for a second to see what sort of questions we have. So Lisa has a question about length. Should this section be about 1/4 to a third of a page long? Yeah, you know, if we're dividing the Aims page into 4, you'd want them to be roughly equal. But again, it's always going to depend on your project and the sort of relative space that you need to describe certain components, especially because you're also considering strategy here, right? You're considering who the audience is for your Aims page and how much context is required to kind of bring them up to speed on what you're doing versus how much time you're describing long-term goal, project objective, scientific premise, general hypothesis, right? That's it's going to depend a little, but I think, you know, a quarter page is a good target. Darlene asks, how do you ensure that you're providing just the right amount of literature review / preliminary data? This is the $1 million question, right? How do you know that you are doing that well? And how do you know that you're providing just the right amount? So remember when we talked yesterday about the problem, gap, and hook, that is also part of the sort of review of the literature or introduction to the literature, right? You are scoping the problem and providing a bit of information about what we know and what we don't know about the gap in knowledge that you're trying to fill, right? And then in that second paragraph, you are providing scope and context for the trajectory that you are on as a researcher and what the main objective of this particular project is. So we already have a bit of context around, again, the scope of the problem and the gap. And so when you get to the point where you are describing the scientific premise of what you're doing and how you arrived at your, you know, general hypothesis or research question, you do need to be concise about that. You do need to stay focused on the gap that you are trying to fill. But you also need to trust that you will have more space to go into this in more depth in your research strategy, right? You've got an entire significant section to get into some of this in more detail, right? So you're just providing sort of the top line need to know information on the Aims page so that they understand how you got to your general hypothesis or your research question. When we get down to brass tacks, that's like 2 to 3 sentences of preliminary data slash supporting evidence, right? When we're talking about that paragraph. But again, remember, you've provided context and orientation elsewhere. Okay. Ashley asked, for phase 1 trials that are meant to be a safety and tolerability trial, is it safe one aim and tolerability another aim? So this will depend, Ashley, on like we'll get to the aims tomorrow in terms of how you structure them. But we want to make sure, like, one of the key considerations around Aims is feasibility, right? And that's why we talk a lot about interdependence of Aims, and because if Aims are interdependent, we end up in a bit of trouble with feasibility, right? So we'll get into that a bit tomorrow, but just think about feasibility when you're thinking about your aims. We'll leave it there for today, and we'll get into that a bit more tomorrow. Would you introduce your potential solution to the gap here? Great question, Kim. So yeah, I mean, this is really where you start doing that, right? You, the solution to filling your gap is essentially the objective of your project tied to how you're going to go about doing that, which is your aims, right? So like all of that together is the solution. It's so just to be really clear here, you're not going to write a sentence that says the objective of this project is to fill the gap. Like you obviously need to go into more specifics than that and describe what your objective is. Like, what are you trying to end up with at the end of this project, right? So that is essentially the solution. But then when we get to your aims, which of course we're talking about tomorrow, that's when we talk about how you're going to go about doing that. And so when you're describing that objective and then the sort of the what and the how, that is the solution. So yes, you do get into part of it in this second section, and then you get into the how of it when you're writing your aims, which again, we'll talk about tomorrow. The hypothesis should be with the objective section, not before. Yeah, so I recommend that, again, you're always moving from broad to specific, right? So you've spent that first section providing the sort of overview of why this research is important and why we need to do it. So here's this big problem that we're trying to solve, and here's one of the gaps that is kind of holding that problem in place. And so we need to fill that gap. And here's what becomes possible when we fill that gap. So that's section number 1. Then in section number 2, you want to remind them, where you are headed as a researcher. And that's going to tie back to what you just described in that first section. And the reason that we do that, again, is because you want to reinforce these concepts and ideas to your reviewers multiple times as you're going through your Aims page, and then ultimately the grant itself, because that's going to help with overall comprehension and really helping them get on board with what it is that you're doing. So creating that internal consistency and that sort of mirroring is a really effective way to make sure that your audience is really going to grasp what it is that you're doing. So the second section here that we're talking about, you want to start out by talking about where you're headed as a researcher, right? And so you're connecting that to the big problem that you described in the first section. And then you're reminding them that your objective with this project is to fill the gap that you identified in that first section. That's why that's why you brought it up in section 1, is because that is actually what you are going to tackle. So you want to do that before you actually get to your hypothesis, because your hypothesis isn't going to make any sense until you've provided context for it, right? So that's why you do it. You want to provide that context. You want to talk about sort of how you arrived there, and then you want to explain what your hypothesis is. And this is where, again, it's going to depend on the content of your project. The content is always going to dictate the structure to some extent, right? This is a loose structure that needs to be sort of finessed depending on your project itself. So for some people, it might make more sense to describe that sort of overarching hypothesis before you describe how you get there. But for others, it might make way more sense to talk about sort of how you got there before you describe the hypothesis. So it's something you can play around with, and that's really going to depend on your individual situation. But you always want to be thinking about how can I orient my reader to what I'm doing, and you want to give them sort of the big picture before you give them the details. Okay. Erica asked, can you discuss more how to best frame the research question if you don't do hypothesis-driven research? Yeah, sure. So you're always still providing context for why you're doing what you're doing, right? So whether it's, for example, like a clinical intervention or some other type of project, you're always talking about why we need to do this. And so you're always still providing supporting evidence and a premise for what you're doing. So the way that you would frame it would be to talk about how you arrived at this particular question that is motivating the project that you're doing. And that, again, in the Aims page is going to take just a few sentences because there isn't really more space in that. But again, you've already provided additional context in that first section where you talk about this overarching problem and the gap that you're trying to fill. So yeah, in that second section, it's really about how did you arrive at this specific question? Should each aim be coupled with a hypothesis? We're going to get to that tomorrow. Again, I want you to stay focused. We're breaking this up into small chunks to make it more digestible. We will get to that tomorrow, I promise you. But for today, we're sticking with the goals and objectives. Nancy asked, this may be more general than what we're covering today, so feel free to skip to talk about another time. Question is, if you are responding to an RFA, do you have advice on how much to echo the language and topics of interest in the RFA in your problem and gap and objective? Yeah, so Nancy, this is beyond what we're covering today. This is really about strategy. And so we're going to stay focused on the Aims page itself. I do teach an entire course on how to write an R01, and we cover stuff like this, but for today, we're really just focused on this particular section of the Aims page. And for this week, we're really focused on the Aims page itself. But yeah, but that's a really excellent strategic question in terms of how to handle that kind of language in the RFA. Should the objective be stated as a process or an outcome? I'm going to ask you, who would like to answer that based on what you have learned today? All right, Myra, Sarah, say outcome. Yes. Yep. Lisa got it too. So you really want to describe it as a deliverable, right? So you want to talk about in terms of what you're gonna end up with at the end of the term of your grant. So like if we're talking about an R01, we're generally talking about a 4 or 5 year project, right? But even if we're talking about a much smaller, like 1 or 2 year grant, you still want to talk about what you're going to get at the end of that term, right? What does success look like? How will you know that you have been successful? And if you describe the objective as a process doesn't necessarily have an endpoint, right? So you want to talk about the objective in terms of something concrete, in terms of a deliverable. Yeah. Any other questions? Were there questions about yesterday's homework? Okay, sorry, I must have missed some of the questions in the chat. Sorry about that, everyone. I will go back and take a look. So Lisa asks, what about the first sentence of the second section? How to have an effective, I assume the missing word there is transition. How to have an effective transition from the first paragraph, scope and gap, to the second section, what I'm doing about the gap. No time for a transition sentence, so perhaps just a theme that connects paragraphs 1 and 2. Yeah, so great question, Lisa. And actually, the way that we typically do this is really just by starting out by stating your long-term goal, because what I want you to remember is in that first section, you are typically ending on the hook. So, what becomes possible when we fill this gap in knowledge? And then if you dive right away into, our long-term research goal, or the long-term research goal of our lab is to blah, blah, blah. You are sort of calling back to what you've described in section 1. And then if you follow that almost immediately with a statement about the objective of your project, you're again calling back to stuff that they've just read in that first section. So you're really helping that sort of reinforcement and allowing folks to really absorb what they're reading. So it doesn't have to be super complicated. It doesn't have to be a pretty sort of thematic transition like we would hope to see in a manuscript, for example. It can really be as simple as starting out by saying, our long-term research goal is to blank, and just leave it at that, because again, you are sort of calling back to what you've just described in that first paragraph. Okay. Another question here about, would love to hear any pointers on how to frame the objective / hypothesis for an intervention. Well, I mean, I guess the question there is, you know, what is the objective, right? It's, I mean, it obviously, it depends on the project itself, but what are you hoping to discover at the end of the intervention, or like what are you hoping that the intervention is going to achieve? And that's how you would describe the objective. A great question here. How is the hook different from or related to the significance of the study? So it sort of ties everything together, right? It ties together the sort of that big problem, that big scientific challenge that we're talking about, and the gap in knowledge that you are trying to fill. And I think what the hook does really well, actually, is point to the impact of the research, right? Because you're saying, if we are able to successfully fill this gap, which we totally intend to do, you know, we have no reason to believe that we're not going to be able to fill this gap. Once we fill this gap in knowledge, this is what becomes possible, right? And so you're really pointing to the impact of the research, which is why it's extra crucial to make sure that you actually include a hook statement in your Aims page, because you don't want your viewers to guess at what the impact is going to be, right? You don't want them to draw their own conclusions about that, even though it might be obvious to you, and it may indeed be obvious to them, but you don't want to leave that to chance. You really want to spell it out and make it obvious so that it's clear that everybody's on the same page. If we are able to do this, here's what can happen next, right? And that really speaks to the impact and the future directions of this line of inquiry, right? Which, again, you are speaking to in that second section when you're talking about your long-term research goal. So that's how those two things connect so beautifully, is you've just explained like what becomes possible when you fill this gap, and then you're reminding them right away in that second section, here's where I'm headed, here's what we're doing as a research team, and you know, here's the ultimate impact that we intend to have with this work. And the next step is to complete this project, so that we can then, you know, move on and do these other things, right? So it's really about the impact, the potential impact of the research. Yeah. Kim asks, what if your gap and problem sound similar? Ooh, I love this question, because that is a sign to go back and try again. It can be really tricky to figure out the distinction early on, but one of the easy ways to do this is to sort of reverse engineer what your problem and your gap are. So let me see how I can explain this. If you are more clear on what your overall objective for your project is, like if that makes more sense to you than describing the gap and figuring out what the difference is between the problem and the gap, if you know what your overall objective is, you can use that to figure out what your gap is, because remember, your overall objective and your gap are connected, just like your problem and your long-term research goal are connected. So if you know, again, if you know what your long-term research goal is, you can figure out what your problem is. And if you know what your overall objective is, you can figure out what your gap is. So you just need to make sure when you're describing your gap that you're using the same sort of keywords and language that you're using to describe your overall objective when you're describing your gap. And remember too, that your problem is much bigger than any one single grant that you're submitting, right? Even a 5-year R01, it goes far beyond that. And so if your problem is something that you're trying to solve in this project, it's probably your gap and not your problem. Does that help? Okay, good. Any other questions about yesterday's homework? It's really tricky, and it does take a lot of practice. So well done to all of you who tried. Oh, and Tamisa's just pointed out a question that I missed from the chat, which I think we're actually going to get to tomorrow because it looks like it's about the aims. So let me read it. Do you advise to have additional hypotheses, for example, the ones for each aim in this section, central hypothesis, or within the aims section below, or does it not matter? Okay, so I will answer this today. That does actually go in the aims. If you do have like sub hypotheses for each of your aims, you would describe those with your aims and not in that second section. So good question. Okay, well, maybe I'll ask all of you, what has been most useful for you so far out of the 3 lessons that we've done to this point? What's the thing that has stuck with you the most up to this point? Problem gap hook. Yep. The structure of the first paragraph and the importance of the hook. Yep. Marion says problem gap hook solution. Yep. Listen, I am a problem gap hook solution evangelist. I will never stop shouting about it. I think it is such a helpful way to think about what it is that you're doing and how to communicate it. Tim says, I think the concrete breakdown. Lisa says, I was flying to Australia and missed the first 2 while in the air, lost time. Looking forward to reviewing those lessons this afternoon. Yes. So a reminder that they are available to you inside the course area, or if you prefer to listen, we do have a private podcast. I'm a podcast person. I like to do stuff while I'm listening, so I can like listen to the lessons and clean the fridge or something. It's I just find it really handy. So I wanted to make that available to all of you. Myra says, how long will these lessons be available? They are available until December 14th. You are welcome. Oh, and Tamisa's just put up the course area login. So if you want to log in, Monday and Tuesday's lessons are already available for you. And of course, if you haven't downloaded the workbook, it is there inside the course area for you as well. Myra says, oh yeah, Myra says most helpful is problem gap hook, but overall learning the purpose of each section. Yes, it's really helpful to know like what you're trying to accomplish in each section of the aims page, right? So that you can be really focused and really efficient about how you prepare it. Sarah says, yep, the hook. Yeah, don't forget it. And it's so easy to forget because you're so immersed in what you're doing, right? You know why it's important because you wouldn't be doing it otherwise, right? But remember that your audience, even if they have sort of overlapping expertise, they don't necessarily see things in the same way that you do. And so it's really, really important for you to spell that out for them, to just connect those dots and make it crystal clear why this matters, what becomes possible when we fill this gap. So you always want to make that explicit. You don't want to leave them to figure it out on their own. You're actually doing them a service by spelling them out because you're making it easier for them. Okay. And this attendee, who is remaining anonymous, says, what you have provided encompasses the anatomy and physiology of the Aims page, which I love. I think that's great. It really is the anatomy of the Aims page and the physiology. Yeah. Kim loves the workbook. Great to hear that. I'm glad you're finding that helpful. Yeah, I really, the intention there is to just help break it down for you and give you prompts so that you can really think about what needs to go in each of those sections. Candace asked, what would be the best method to phrase an exploratory research question and solution? Okay, so this actually gets a little bit more into strategy, Candace. And you're going to want to make sure that that the funding opportunity that you're applying to is really welcoming to exploratory questions, right? Because a lot of the work that we focus on here is not meant to be exploratory. And so the frameworks that we have and that we use are for more sort of experimental approaches, right? And so you want to really make sure that wherever you're applying is welcoming to exploratory questions, and that especially that your peer reviewers are gonna understand that. So Catherine says, I'm logged in online and only see resource library under my courses. That is a technical question that hopefully Tamisa can help you with. Yeah, I mean, you should have access to the specific Aims Accelerator course area as well. All right. Good. Any other questions for today? Well, folks, what I will do is share my screen again and show you what is on deck for tomorrow. Boop, boop. Okay. So actually, first I'm going to tell you about your homework, and then I'm going to tell you about what's on deck for tomorrow. So you are going to want to write a section. You're going to want to write a draft of section 2 that includes your long-term research goal, your proposed research objective, a summary of that key supporting evidence for your general hypothesis or your research question, and then, your general hypothesis or research question, right? And again, remember that you can sort of play around with the order of, whether you describe your research question before you describe the supporting evidence or whether you do it the other way around. It's really just going to depend style-wise on what makes the most sense for you. And tomorrow, here's a little preview. We're going to cover how to write your aims and your expected outcomes. So we're going to cover both sections 3 and 4 tomorrow. So don't miss it. It's going to be hefty tomorrow because we are going to cover these two, because we still have to talk about on Friday what you do once you have a full draft of your aims page, right? What then? So we want to make sure that we leave time for that, which is why we're covering both 3 and 4 tomorrow. So make sure that you're here, make sure that you're ready. Tomorrow, we're also going to cover how to think about your aims so that they're not overly ambitious or too incremental. Sometimes that can feel a little bit like threading a needle, but we will talk about all of that tomorrow. Okay, let me just check the chat one more time. Okay, we've got people sorting out emails and all of that. So I'm going to stop my sharing and I will leave it at that for today. Go off and do your homework and I will see you tomorrow. Great to have you all here. All right, take care, everybody.